Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin with Utah Chess Institute. Today I wanted to share an annotated game played by one of my students. So she is 9 years old and I've been coaching her for a little under a year now. Her rating is around 1950 on leechess.org and I was incredibly proud of the way she played this game. So let's jump in. She was white here and her opponent was black. Her opponent was rated 1971 on leechess.org. So they're both around 1950, which in chess.com terms is around 1500 is 1000 plus 250. So they're around 1300, I'd say. 1400. Maybe a little bit higher, maybe like 1450 on chess.com. So the game started with d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit, and e6, the queen's gambit declined. And I always recommend my students play just simple pawn structures that we can be comfortable going into. And so she plays the exchange variation and then knight to c3, just putting pressure on the center. And now white has two center pawns, a d and an e pawn, against black's one. So black no longer has an e pawn because white traded their c pawn for black's e pawn. So very favorable for white. The only downside is black has a pawn majority on the queen side, so you have to be careful about that. Game continues with bishop to e7, bit of a strange move. Top engine move here is c6. A lot of people play knight to f6. So if f6 is not occupied by a knight, then we don't have bishop to g5, and so bishop to f4 is the next best thing. Her opponent played knight to f6, and now she connected her pawn chains with the move e3. Black now plays the move c6, also connecting their pawn chain. And now I think it would have been a little bit better for black to have played bishop to f5, because now this diagonal is occupied by white's light square bishop on d3. Black castles. White plays queen to c2, immediately putting pressure on black's king side. Black makes luft and plays the pawn to h6. I think this is unnecessary because a lot of times you actually don't want the pawn to be pushed here because you want to make sure you can capture on g6 with two pawns. And the reason is because the knight will actually reroute to f8 and then to the square g6, which attacks the bishop. And if you take it, it doesn't really do a whole lot for white. But now a knight can never go to g6 because you'll lose a pawn. So I like the knight reroute to f8, very safe king, and then to g6, which actually starts to attack on the king side, which is where black's pawn structure is pointing. But black just played the simple h6, and like I said, it's not as flexible, and so now black has one less plan that they're able to execute, just because of a simple pawn move. White continues with knight to e2. I really like this move because it's very flexible and it guards these key squares for the bishop, just in case this happens, which it does, which is knight to h5. A little bit of an annoying move because now you're probably going to lose your dark square bishop, but that's okay. First the bishop goes to e5 and the knight goes to d7. Bishop to e5 is hoping to create light square pawn weaknesses around, light square color weaknesses around black's king with the move f6. But instead black just develops with knight to d7. The computer here wants h3 because after pawn to h3, knight takes, pawn takes, you're threatening g4, which traps the knight. So black has to play the move g6 here, and now you're always threatening to sacrifice on g6 and rip open the king side. But instead, my student just played bishop to g3. Now we have the move b5, which is a little bit too aggressive. The idea here for black is the knight's going to go to b6 and then try and stake out this square on c4. But it's not a true outpost because white can always play the move b3. And because it's happening so early, the knight here is actually not really coordinating with any other piece to attack anything significant. So I think black is committing to a strategy way too early here, and this pawn is going to be backwards. And you'll see that these dark squares on the queen side become a huge problem for black. So white continues with castling, and now the knight takes the dark square bishop, and the knight takes back. And now f5 is a key weakness here on the king side, which the knight wants to jump into. Black continues with his plan of knight to b6, looking to jump into c4. And I really like here that instead of playing a move like b3, which I think a lot of people would do instantly because they say like, oh, this knight into c4 is really annoying. But once you play b3, c1 is hard to control because there's always this bishop to a3 move. So your dark squares get really weak. So instead you just kind of let black spend all this time jumping in, and eventually when the knight becomes annoying, then you can kick it out. So don't make weaknesses until you absolutely have to. So here she just played rook to c1, putting more pressure on the c file and sort of baiting this knight move. Because if this pawn is undefended and the only thing protecting the pawn is the knight on c4, let's say the knight moves away, then you can kick it out and then you can take the pawn right afterwards. So you're really setting up some tactics here instead of just playing your move so obviously. If you stop your opponent's plans long before they start, then it really tells you where your opponent should go. So it's kind of like water, right? You want to let the water get all the way to you and then build the dam so that it just stops in its tracks. But if you see it coming from a long ways away and you stop it, it's just going to find an alternate route. So you don't want to stop it before it even starts. You want to stop it as soon as it's happening. That way they spent all this time to prepare it and then it doesn't work. They have to then spend all this time to do something else. But if you stop it before it even starts, then they didn't spend any time preparing it. They can just start to spend what they would have spent in terms of time doing something else, and therefore you basically just tell them what to do, because if plan 1 isn't going to work, then they'll change over to plan 2. It makes chess really easy for your opponent. So her opponent continued by expanding on the queen side. Makes sense, it's very thematic. And now it appears this knight is going to get destabilized from the c3 square, and I really like that she reroutes it to e2. Moving over to the king side, which feels like, or the center, which feels like maybe where white should be playing. Her opponent continues with bishop to b7, which makes a lot of sense. This pawn is now super weak. But you'll notice that the bishops are really the key controllers of colored squares. This bishop is the only one holding down the dark squares around the center and the queen side. And this pawn just moved away from controlling light squares. So this is really the only pawn that controls light squares on the king side, and this guy is never going to be able to come over to the king side to help control the light squares. So if you can occupy the dark squares on the queen side and infiltrate on the light squares on the king side, should be an easy plan, and that's actually exactly what happens in this game. So the knight jumps to f5, which is just a great square for the knight. It's protected by a lot of white's pieces. Even though it looks like it's floating out there, it's actually nice and anchored. And it makes it very uncomfortable for this dark square bishop, because even if he goes here, you can kick it out with a move like a3. So the bishop goes to g5, but it's very unstable here. If we can make h4 work, obviously we already have one defender, so without the queen, then h4 would be a really annoying move for black. And now you see that the dark squares on the queen side are much weaker, because this bishop is no longer able to protect these squares. And so she immediately pounces on the outpost c5. So queen to c5 puts a lot of pressure on these three pieces. The queen is a little bit overloaded protecting both pieces, so the move h4 is now in the air. The knight jumps back to d7, and this is where white starts to get a big advantage. I think the knight really should have gone to c4. And now, like I said, following the theme of color weaknesses, my student moved her queen to d6. Just very centralized queen, and coordinating well with this knight. This square is starting to seem weaker and weaker. And so the rook slides over to e8, and now this queen is overloaded. Can't protect the h4 square and the knight at the same time, and so this move h4 is just throwing a wrench into all the operations of black's position. So the bishop has to move. Bishop drops back to e7, and yeah, we could take the bishop and just make black suffer with a terrible bishop, but we would have to find a way to trade off this knight for this bishop, and then we would play good knight versus bad bishop, which would be a pretty easy win, but it would take a lot more work. Instead, let's continue the attack and play with this good knight against this bad bishop. And she played queen to g3 here, which I think is just a brilliant move. It threatens mate in 1. It reroutes the queen from the queen side to the king side. Now the king side is incredibly weak. I don't really see any any defenders of the queen side. And so we're threatening mate here, but there's also the threat of knight takes h6, which, remember in the beginning I said I didn't like the move h6, and it's because those weakening king moves, really just one pawn move can be the end of a game. The bishop drops back to the square f8, and this is a huge mistake. The f8 square needs to be a flight square for the king, and the bishop really has to go to the f6 square. So miscalculating here, thinking that solving one threat is solving all of black's problems. Black plays bishop to f8, but we still have another threat, and that's knight takes h6. And we'll see why the f8 square, the king not being able to go here, immediately causes the loss of the game. So h7 is occupied by the bishop, so the king has to go to h8. And now my student, if I look at the timestamps, took about a minute and a half to find this move, but the fact that she found this move is awesome. This is why doing puzzles is so important. And that is simply knight takes f7, check. And you're forking the king and the queen. Game over, her opponent resigned. So again, occupying the dark square color weaknesses on the queen side to get the queen in, and then reroute to the king side, and then use the light square color weaknesses that this bishop being stuck on b7 creates, and the knight being useless on d7 to just simply win the game. So I highly recommend you look for color weaknesses in your games, try and exploit them, and yeah, I hope you guys found that useful. I was very proud of my student for playing this game, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoy that. So take care.